Number 1, Robert Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher. If you walk down Charlotte Street in Kansas City today, you will see a vacant lot. The ground is empty, covered in grass, indistinguishable from any other plot of land. But in the 1980s, a house stood there. It was a house that neighbors described as eccentric, filled with strange artifacts and curiosities. But what the neighbors didn't know was that the true collection wasn't on the shelves, it was in the bedroom. And the man who lived there, a seemingly helpful neighborhood watch member named Robert Berdella, was meticulously documenting one of the most sadistic torture sprees in American history. He stands as number 1 on our list because he represents the ultimate violation of humanity. He didn't just kill his victims, he treated them as science experiments in pain, recording every scream, every injection, and every moment of suffering in a set of logs that remain the most terrifying documents ever read by the FBI. To understand Robert Berdella, you have to look past the mask. Born in Ohio in 1949, Berdella moved to Kansas City in the late 60s to attend the Kansas City Art Institute. He was a figure of the counterculture, intelligent, artistic, and deeply involved in the community. By the 1980s, he was a known local figure. He owned a novelty shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, which sold everything from human skulls to occult items. He was passionate about neighborhood safety, ironically serving as the coordinator for the local neighborhood watch. He would often be seen patrolling the streets, reporting suspicious activity to the police, projecting the image of a concerned citizen. But inside 4315, Charlotte Street, Berdella was building a dungeon. His descent into monstrosity was fueled by a dark obsession with control and fantasy. He was inspired by the movie The Collector, based on the John Fowles novel, in which a man captures a woman just to keep her. Berdella wanted to capture men. He wanted to transform them into his sex slaves, to completely dominate their existence. His reign of terror began in 1984. His victims were young men, often drifters, male prostitutes, or individuals on the fringes of society whom he thought no one would miss. His first known victim was 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Jerry was not a drifter, he was a student, a young man with a bright future who had disappeared just days before a dance contest. Berdella lured him to the house. What followed was the establishment of Berdella's horrific methodology. He drugged Howell. He bound him. And then, he began the experiments. Robert Berdella was not satisfied with simple murder. He wanted to prolong the experience. He used a terrifying cocktail of animal tranquilizers, electrical shocks, and physical torture to keep his victims in a state of twilight consciousness. He wanted them awake enough to feel pain, but too drugged to resist. He would keep them for days, sometimes weeks. And he wrote it all down. The torture logs, as they came to be known, are the reason Berdella haunts the nightmares of investigators to this day. In meticulous handwriting, he recorded the date, the time, the dosage of drugs administered, and the specific torture techniques used. He noted the victims' reactions with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a lab rat. July 5, 10 a.m., injected victim with 2 cubic centimeters of thorazine. Victim is groggy. July 6, applied electrical current to victim's eyelids. Victim screamed. He also took photographs. Polaroids of men bound, gagged, and terrified. These were his trophies, his way of reliving the power long after the victims were dead. When the victims finally succumbed, either from the drugs or asphyxiation, Berdella would dismember them in his bathtub. He was methodical in his disposal. He would cut the bodies into small pieces, put them in garbage bags, and leave them out for the trash collectors. The Kansas City Butcher literally fed his victims to the city's sanitation system. He kept the skulls of some victims, burying them in his backyard or hiding them in his closet. For 3 years, men disappeared in Kansas City. Jerry Howell in 1984. Robert Sheldon in 1985. Mark Wallace in 1985. James Ferris in 1985. Todd Stoops in 1986. Larry Pearson in 1987. 6 men. 6 lives extinguished in the house on Charlotte Street, while Berdella continued to run his shop and chat with his neighbors. The case broke open on a quiet Saturday morning, April 2, 1988. A neighbor saw a young man wearing nothing but a dog collar and a leash, leaping from the second-story window of Berdella's house. The man, Christopher Bryson, was 23 years old. He landed on the porch, bruised and terrified, and ran to a neighbor's car, pleading for help. When the police arrived, they found Bryson in a state of shock. He told them a story that sounded impossible. He said he had been held captive for 4 days. He said Berdella had drugged him, tied him up, and tortured him with electricity. He showed them the needle marks on his arm and the burns on his body. The Kansas City Police Department obtained a search warrant for 4315 Charlotte Street. They expected to find perhaps some drugs or restraints. They were not prepared for what they found. Inside the house, they found the torture chamber. They found syringes, electrical transformers, and restraints. But the smoking gun was a shoebox found in the bedroom. Inside were hundreds of Polaroid photographs depicting the torture and dismemberment of the missing men. And next to the photos were the journals, the detailed logs of death. They also found 2 human skulls buried in the backyard. DNA analysis later linked them to the missing men. Robert Berdella was arrested. The community was stunned. The man who sold them novelties, the man who walked the streets looking for burglars, was a monster. During the interrogation, Berdella was chillingly cooperative. He treated the interview like a lecture. He explained his motives, his fascination with total control, and his disappointment that his experiments ultimately ended in death. He claimed he didn't want them to die, he wanted them to be his permanent slaves, but the human body couldn't withstand the trauma he inflicted. To avoid the death penalty, Robert Berdella agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He confessed to killing 6 men, though police suspect there may have been more. He provided full details of the crimes, guiding police through the horrors recorded in his journals. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In prison, Berdella continued to be a source of dark fascination. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and complained about the prison food. He never showed genuine remorse for the pain he caused, he only showed regret that his project was interrupted. Robert Berdella died in the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1992 of a heart attack. He took his last breath behind bars, far away from the house on Charlotte Street. Following his death, the city of Kansas City made a decision. They bought the house at 4315 Charlotte Street. They didn't sell it. They didn't renovate it. They demolished it. They tore it down to the foundation, filled in the basement, and planted grass. They wanted to erase the physical scar of Robert Berdella from the earth. But the psychological scar remains. Robert Berdella is number 1 on our list because he represents the ultimate nightmare, the neighbor who smiles at you while keeping a dungeon in his home. His meticulous logs prove that for some human beings, the suffering of others is not a tragedy, but a hobby. Number 2, Lisa Montgomery. If Robert Berdella represented the darkness of the city basement, our next case takes us to the desolate, windswept plains of northwest Missouri. We travel to the tiny town of Skidmore. It is a town with a population of less than 300, yet it holds a disproportionate weight in the annals of American crime. It is a place that feels cursed. In 1981, it was the site of the vigilante killing of town bully Ken McElroy. But in 2004, a horror arrived in Skidmore that made the McElroy case look like a simple dispute. This time, the violence was intimate, feminine, and terrifyingly biological. Number 2 on our list is the case of Lisa Montgomery. It is a story that explores the most primal obsession, the desire to be a mother, twisted into a murderous delusion. It is a crime of fetal abduction, a term so clinical it fails to capture the nightmare of a woman cutting an unborn child from another woman's womb. Lisa Montgomery shocked the entire state because she turned the miracle of birth into an act of butchery, and her actions led to her becoming the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 7 decades. To understand the tragedy, we must first look at the victim, 23-year-old Bobby Jo Stinnett. Bobby Jo was the picture of wholesome Missouri life. She was married, deeply in love, and 8 months pregnant with her first child. She and her husband raised rat terriers, a breed of small dogs, at their modest home in Skidmore. She was known in the online dog breeding community as a kind, helpful expert. She was radiating the glow of expectant motherhood, excitedly preparing the nursery for her baby girl. She had no idea that her happiness was being watched. She had no idea that hundreds of miles away, in Melbourne, Kansas, a woman was looking at her pregnancy photos not with joy, but with envy and a calculated, predatory intent. That woman was Lisa Montgomery. At 36 years old, Lisa's life was a chaotic tapestry of trauma and lies. She had a history of severe childhood abuse, alleged incest, and mental instability. But the defining characteristic of her adult life was her compulsive lying, specifically about pregnancy. Lisa had undergone a tubal ligation procedure years earlier. She was physically incapable of having more children. Yet, she had convinced her new husband and her entire social circle that she was pregnant. She wore maternity clothes. She faked ultrasounds. She talked about names. As her due date approached, the pressure mounted. The lie was about to collapse. She needed a baby. And in her fractured mind, she decided that if she couldn't grow one, she would take one. The hunt began on the internet. Lisa frequented a chat room called Rat or Chatter, a forum for rat terrier enthusiasts. There, she found Bobby Jo Stinnett. She saw Bobby Jo's posts about her puppies and her pregnancy. She saw a target. Using the alias Darlene Fisher, Lisa contacted Bobby Jo. She claimed she was interested in buying a puppy. They exchanged emails. Lisa, playing the role of a fellow dog lover, groomed Bobby Jo. They agreed to meet. Lisa would drive from Kansas to Skidmore to look at the dogs. On December 16, 2004, a cold, gray Thursday, Lisa Montgomery drove her red Toyota Corolla to Skidmore. She brought with her a terrifying kit, a kitchen knife, rope, and clamps. When she arrived at the white farmhouse, Bobby Jo welcomed her in. Bobby Jo was alone, her husband was at work. She thought she was selling a puppy to a nice lady named Darlene. They went into the living room. What happened next is a scene of horror that haunts the first responders to this day. At some point, while Bobby Jo was likely showing her a dog or distracted, Lisa Montgomery attacked. She strangled the 23-year-old mother from behind. Bobby Jo fought. The struggle was violent. Clumps of hair were later found in her hands. But Lisa overpowered her. She choked Bobby Jo until she lost consciousness. Then, while Bobby Jo was either unconscious or barely clinging to life, Lisa Montgomery performed a crude, horrific cesarean section using the kitchen knife. She sliced open Bobby Jo's abdomen. She reached inside the womb. And she removed the premature baby girl. It was an act of medieval savagery committed in a modern living room. Lisa Montgomery then did the unthinkable. She took the baby. She cut the umbilical cord. She didn't call for help. She didn't check on the dying mother. She simply wrapped the newborn in a blanket, walked out of the house, got into her Toyota, and drove away. She left Bobby Jo Stinnett bleeding to death on the floor, her body desecrated, her dreams stolen. The discovery of the crime was heartbreaking. Bobby Jo's mother, Becky Harper, came to the house about an hour later. She found her daughter in a pool of blood. In the initial chaos and trauma, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. She called 911 and screamed, "It looks like her stomach has exploded." When paramedics arrived, they realized the horrifying truth: there was no baby. The state of Missouri went into immediate lockdown. An Amber Alert was issued, but this was a unique nightmare. They were looking for a baby that had literally just been born, a baby that had no name and no medical records. The clock was ticking. A premature infant without medical care would not survive long. The investigation that followed was a triumph of digital forensics. The FBI and local authorities dove into Bobby Joe's computer. They found the emails from Darlene Fisher. They traced the IP address. It didn't lead to a Darlene, it led to the Montgomery farmhouse in Melbourne, Kansas. The next day, December 17th, heavily armed agents surrounded Lisa Montgomery's property. Inside, they found a surreal scene. Lisa was sitting on the couch, watching television, holding a newborn baby. She was introducing the baby to her husband and friends as their daughter. She looked calm. She looked happy. When the agents entered, the charade ended. They identified the baby as the missing child of Bobby Joe Stinnett. Miraculously, the baby was alive and healthy. Lisa Montgomery was arrested. The interrogation of Lisa Montgomery revealed the depth of her delusion. At first, she insisted the baby was hers. She told a convoluted story about going into labor while shopping. But faced with the physical impossibility, and the fact that her tubes were tied, she eventually confessed. She described the drive, the strangulation, and the birth. She spoke about it with a disturbing detachment, viewing the baby as an object she had acquired to fix her life. The legal battle that ensued was fierce. Lisa was charged with kidnapping resulting in death, a federal crime. Because she crossed state lines, from Kansas to Missouri, to commit the murder, the federal government took jurisdiction, which meant the death penalty was on the table. Her defense team argued the insanity plea. They detailed her horrific childhood, claiming she suffered from pseudopsoriasis, false pregnancy, bipolar disorder, and complex PTSD. They argued that she was in a dissociative state, that she was a broken woman who had lost touch with reality. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They pointed to the planning. The internet research on how to perform a C-section. The rope. The knife. The Darlene Fisher alias. They argued this wasn't a snap of insanity, it was a cold, calculated predatory act. She hunted a pregnant woman for the specific purpose of harvesting a child. In 2007, the jury sided with the prosecution. Lisa Montgomery was found guilty and sentenced to death. For over a decade, Lisa sat on federal death row. She was the only woman there. Her case became a flashpoint for debates about mental health and capital punishment. Her lawyers fought tirelessly, arguing that executing a severely mentally ill woman who had been a victim of sex trafficking and incest was a human rights violation. However, the nature of her crime, the visceral horror of cutting a baby from a mother's womb, left little room for public sympathy. In January 2021, in the final days of the Trump administration, the execution date was set. It was a chaotic legal finish, with stays of execution granted and then lifted by the Supreme Court in a matter of hours. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was strapped to a gurney at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. When asked if she had any last words, she simply said, "No." She was executed by lethal injection. She was 52 years old. She became the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government since 1953. But the legacy of this case is not about Lisa Montgomery. It is about the miracle in the midst of the tragedy. The baby girl, named Victoria Jo, survived. She was returned to her father, Zeb Stinnett. She was raised in the quiet love of her family, shielded from the spotlight. She is a teenager now, a living testament to her mother's strength. The murder of Bobby Joe Stinnett stands as number 2 because it broke a taboo. We accept that criminals kill for money, for revenge, or for lust. But the idea that a woman would kill another woman to steal her unborn child strikes a chord of terror that is almost biblical. It left a permanent scar on Skidmore, a town that has seen too much blood, and it shocked the entire state of Missouri with the realization that the most dangerous predator might be the smiling woman asking to buy a puppy. Number 3, Ray and Faye Copeland. If Lisa Montgomery shocked us with the violence of a mother, our next case shocks us with the violence of grandparents. We travel now to the rural heart of the state, to Mooresville, a tiny community in Livingston County. It is a landscape of barns, silos, and vast stretches of grazing land. In the late 1980s, on a rundown farm off a gravel road, lived a couple that seemed to have stepped out of a Grant Wood painting. Ray Copeland was 75 years old, a cantankerous, overall-wearing farmer leaning on his cane. His wife, Faye, was 69, a quiet, dutiful housewife who spent her days gardening and sewing. To the casual observer, they were just another pair of struggling farmers trying to hold on to their land in their twilight years. But inside that farmhouse, and buried in the soil of their cattle pastures, was a secret that would earn them a terrifying title: the oldest couple on death row. Ray and Faye Copeland stand as number 3 on our list because they turned the plight of the poor into a business model. They didn't kill for passion, they killed for profit. They treated human beings, specifically homeless drifters, as disposable tools, using them to commit fraud and then executing them with a single shot to the back of the head when their usefulness ran out. To understand the mechanics of this horror, you have to understand Ray Copeland. Ray was a con man. He had been a fraudster his entire life, with a rap sheet dating back to the 1930s for stealing livestock and writing bad checks. He was known in the local community as a cheat, a man who would stiff you on a bill or sell you a sick cow. But as he got older, his scams became more desperate and more deadly. Ray had a problem: he was banned from buying and selling cattle at the local auctions because of his history of bouncing checks. He needed a way to buy cows, sell them for profit, and never pay for them. He needed a face to do the transactions. His solution was diabolical. Ray would drive to the missions and shelters in nearby cities like Columbia or Springfield. He would look for the most down-on-their-luck men he could find. He looked for drifters, alcoholics, men with no family ties, men who were invisible to society. He would approach them with a grandfatherly smile and an offer that sounded like salvation: "Come work on my farm. I'll give you $50 a week, 3 hot meals, and a roof over your head." For a man sleeping under a bridge, this was a dream come true. They piled into Ray's truck, believing they were heading toward a new beginning. Once on the farm, the trap was set. Ray would treat them well at first. Faye would cook them dinner. Then, Ray would explain the business arrangement. He would tell the drifter that he had some trouble with the bank and needed the farmhand to open a checking account in their own name. Ray would provide the money, which was actually invalid or non-existent funds, to seed the account. Then, he would send the drifter to the cattle auction to buy cows using those checks. The drifter would buy the cows. Ray would take the cows and quickly sell them to a third party for cash. When the checks eventually bounced a few days or weeks later, the police would come looking for the drifter whose name was on the check, not Ray. But Ray knew that eventually, the drifter might talk. He might point the finger at the old man on the farm. So, Ray instituted a brutal policy: absolute silence. When the scam was complete, or when the drifter began to ask for his wages, Ray would take him out to the barn or the back pasture. He would tell them they were going to look for a stray cow or fix a fence. Ray would walk behind them. He would raise his .22 caliber Marlin bolt-action rifle, a simple farm gun, and shoot them in the back of the head. He would then bury them in shallow graves around the farm, often inside the barns where the smell of manure would mask the scent of decomposition. And then, he would go back to the house, eat the dinner Faye had cooked, and prepare to go find the next employee. This cycle of lure, fraud, and murder continued for years. At least 5 men fell victim to the Copelands: Paul Jason Coward, John Freeman, Jimmy Dale Harvey, Wayne Warner, and Dennis Murphy. These were men who had slipped through the cracks of society, and Ray Copeland made sure they never climbed back out. The conspiracy began to unravel in the summer of 1989, thanks to a man named Jack McCormick. Jack was another drifter Ray had picked up. He was a rough character, a heavy drinker with a criminal record of his own, but he had street smarts. He began to sense that something was wrong. He noticed that other farmhands had moved on without saying goodbye, leaving their belongings behind. He saw the way Ray looked at him. One day, Ray tried to kill him. Depending on the account, Ray either tried to shoot him and the gun jammed, or Jack simply saw the setup coming and bolted. Jack McCormick fled the farm. He ran to the authorities, not initially to report a murder, but to protect himself from the bad check charges that were starting to catch up with him. He told the police a wild story: "There are bodies on that farm. That old man is killing people." At first, the police were skeptical. It sounded like the ramblings of a drunk trying to get out of trouble. But Jack was insistent. He told them to look for the X. This is where Faye Copeland enters the dark spotlight. When police finally raided the farm in October of 1989, they found a scene of rural squalor. But inside the farmhouse, they found the evidence that would seal the couple's fate. They found a notebook. It was a ledger. In it, in Faye Copeland's handwriting, was a list of names. They were the names of the drifters who had worked for them. Next to several of the names, there was a crude X mark. Paul Cowart. X. John Freeman. X. The police began to dig. Using cadaver dogs and backhoes, they turned over the soil of the Copeland farm. One by one, the bodies were revealed. 3 bodies were found in a barn. Another was found in a well. They had all been shot in the back of the head at close range. The sweet grandmother, Faye, claimed ignorance. She claimed she was a battered wife, that Ray beat her and controlled her, and that she had no idea what he was doing in the barn. She painted herself as another victim. But the physical evidence in the house told a different story. Police found the clothes of the dead men washed, folded, and stored in Faye's closets. There were rumors, chilling, though sometimes debated, that she was using the flannel shirts of the victims to make a quilt. Whether the quilt was finished or not, the fact remained: she was washing the blood out of the clothes of the men her husband murdered so they could be reused or kept. She knew. The X marks in her ledger proved she was the bookkeeper of death. The trial in 1990 was a sensation. It was a spectacle to see 2 people in their 70s, needing hearing aids and canes, sitting at the defense table charged with serial murder. Ray Copeland tried to plead insanity and senility. He acted confused, drooling and staring blankly. But prosecutors argued it was an act. They showed how calculating his cattle scams were. They showed he was sharp enough to manipulate the banking system and the legal system. Faye Copeland's defense of battered woman syndrome garnered some sympathy, but the jury could not overlook the list and the clothes. In March of 1991, Ray Copeland was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. At 76, he became the oldest person on death row in America. Faye Copeland was also convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the oldest woman on death row. The end of the Copeland saga was quiet, contrasting with the violence of their crimes. Ray Copeland never met the executioner. He died of natural causes in prison in 1993. His body was unclaimed. Faye Copeland spent over a decade in prison. In 1999, a federal judge overturned her death sentence, ruling that the jury had not been allowed to hear enough evidence about the abuse she suffered at Ray's hands. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. But then, in 2002, suffering from a stroke and partially paralyzed, she was granted medical parole and released to a nursing home. She died there in 2003, at the age of 82. The case of Ray and Faye Copeland stands as number 3 because it is a grotesque perversion of the American dream. They were land-rich but soul-poor. They looked at the most vulnerable members of society, the homeless, the addicted, the lost, and saw them not as people who needed help, but as livestock to be used and slaughtered. The image of the X next to a name in a grandmother's notebook remains one of the most chilling artifacts in Missouri history, a reminder that evil can wear an apron and sit in a rocking chair. Number 4, Maury Travis. We leave the farmlands of Mooresville and travel to the sprawling suburbs of St. Louis. Specifically, we go to Ferguson, Missouri, a place that would later become famous for civil unrest, but in the early 2000s, was a quiet, working-class community. On a nondescript street stood a tidy, well-kept house. The lawn was manicured. The owner, a 36-year-old man named Maury Travis, was a waiter at a popular hotel restaurant. He was polite, paid his bills on time, and waved to his neighbors. He was the definition of unremarkable. But Maury Travis stands as number 4 on our list because the basement of that tidy house contained a secret so vile it traumatized the FBI agents who uncovered it. Travis was a sexual sadist who hunted the streets of St. Louis for women he considered disposable. He is on this list because of the terrifying legacy he left behind, a collection of videotapes that documented the torture and murder of his victims, and an arrogant letter to a newspaper that proved to be one of the biggest mistakes in criminal history. To understand Maury Travis, you have to understand the duality of his existence. To his co-workers, he was a reliable employee. To his mother, whom he was close with, he was a good son. But internally, Travis was consumed by a hatred of women and a desire for absolute domination. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to own. His hunting grounds were the strips of St. Louis known for prostitution and drug activity. In 2001 and 2002, women began to disappear. These were women like Alicia Greenwade and Betty James, vulnerable, struggling with addiction, living on the margins. When they vanished, the city didn't immediately panic. In high-crime areas, disappearances are often tragically overlooked or attributed to the lifestyle. Travis counted on this indifference. He believed that because society didn't care about these women, he could do whatever he wanted with them. He would lure them into his car, drive them to his home in Ferguson, and lead them down to the basement. Once there, the facade of the nice guy evaporated. He had retrofitted his basement into a torture chamber, complete with shackles, beams, and video equipment. This is the detail that separates Travis from many other predators. He wanted an audience, even if that audience was just himself in the future. He filmed his crimes. He set up a camcorder on a tripod and recorded the hours-long sessions of abuse. In these tapes, later recovered by police, Travis can be heard taunting his bound victims. In one particularly chilling segment, he looks at a terrified woman and says, "Your name is suffering." He treated the torture as a performance, a sick play where he was the director and the star. For months, he operated with impunity. The police had found a few bodies dumped in remote areas, skeletal and decomposed, but they had no leads. There was no DNA match in the system. There were no witnesses. Maury Travis was the perfect, invisible, predator. But then, his ego got the better of him. In May of 2002, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a column about the missing women. The article suggested that the police were baffled and hinted that perhaps the women had simply moved away. It also profiled a different serial killer case, giving attention to another criminal. Maury Travis read this article, and he was insulted. He was offended that he wasn't getting the credit for his work. He wanted the city to know there was a master predator on the loose. He wanted to taunt the police. So, he sat down at his computer. He printed out a map from the website Expedia.com. On the map, he marked a big X on a location in West Alton, near the Mississippi River. He put the map in an envelope and mailed it to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch with an anonymous letter. The letter bragged about the killings, taunting the police for their incompetence. He wrote, "I'll tell you where many others are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. The reporter who received the letter immediately contacted the police. Officers raced to the location marked with the X. There, decomposed in the brush, they found a human skull. It was the remains of a missing woman. Maury Travis had proven his point, he was real, and he was deadly. But in his arrogance, he had made a fatal technological error. In 2002, the internet was still relatively new to criminal investigations, and Travis clearly didn't understand how it worked. He assumed that printing a map from a website was anonymous. He was wrong. The police examined the Expedia map. In the footer of the printed page, there was a tiny, obscure string of numbers and letters, a URL script. Detectives, working with early cyberforensics experts, contacted Expedia. They asked, "Can you tell us who generated this specific map?" Expedia looked at their server logs. They traced the specific request code in the URL. It led them back to a specific IP address. That IP address belonged to a computer in Ferguson, Missouri. The account holder was Maury Travis. It was a breakthrough that changed modern policing. The killer hadn't been caught by a fingerprint or a witness, he had been caught by a hyperlink. On June 7, 2002, a tactical team swarmed the house in Ferguson. Maury Travis was arrested. He seemed stunned. He couldn't understand how they had found him. But the true horror awaited the investigators inside the house. When they searched the basement, they found the shackles. They found the instruments of torture. But most damning of all, they found the videotapes. The police found a library of horror. Tape after tape labeled with the names of women. When they hit play, they saw the crimes unfolding in real time. They saw Alicia Greenwade. They saw Betty James. They saw women who had been listed as missing, alive and terrified on the screen, pleading for their lives while Travis mocked them. The psychological toll on the officers who had to watch these tapes for evidence cannot be overstated. They were witnessing the last moments of human beings who had been tortured for sport. The evidence linked Travis to at least 12 murders, though he alluded to having killed 17 women in his letter. Maury Travis was taken to the St. Louis County Jail. He was placed in a holding cell. The authorities were preparing for a high-profile trial. They had the tapes, they had the map, they had a slam-dunk case for the death penalty. But justice would be denied. On June 10, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, a guard doing a routine check found Maury Travis hanging in his cell. He had managed to hang himself. He left no suicide note. He gave no final confession. He simply checked out. He took the coward's way out, denying the families of the victims the chance to see him face a judge, denying them the chance to tell him what he took from them. The suicide of Maury Travis left a void of answers. We will never know the true number of his victims. We will never know exactly when he started or if he had accomplices, though evidence suggests he acted alone. The house in Ferguson stood as a grim monument for a short time before, like Robert Berdella's house, it was eventually dealt with. But the legacy of Maury Travis endures in the digital age. He was one of the first serial killers to be caught specifically because of his digital footprint. Maury Travis is number 4 on our list because he represents the Gigo killer. He had gotten away with murder. He was invisible. If he had never sent that map, he might have continued killing for years. He is a terrifying reminder that sometimes, the only thing that stops a monster is his own need to be famous. Number 5, Michael Devlin. We leave the grim basements of serial killers and travel to the quiet, affluent suburb of Kirkwood, Missouri. It is January, 2007. Kirkwood is the kind of place known for its historic train station and its strong sense of community. It is a safe place. But in an apartment complex on a busy street, a crime was taking place that would rewrite the textbooks on kidnapping and psychological control. Number 5 on our list is Michael Devlin, a man who didn't kill his victims, but instead stole their lives, their identities, and their voices, hiding them in plain sight while the world searched in vain. To understand the magnitude of this case, we must start with the catalyst, the mistake that brought the house of cards crashing down. On January 8, 2007, a 13-year-old boy named Ben Omby got off his school bus in the rural town of Beaufort, Missouri. It was a mundane Monday afternoon. But Ben never made it to his front door. A white pickup truck pulled up, a man jumped out, and in seconds, Ben was gone. The abduction of Ben Omby triggered a massive, frantic search. But unlike many cases that go cold, this one had a witness. A brave schoolmate saw the truck. He saw it was a white Nissan. And critically, he described the kidnapper as a heavy-set man. 4 days later, police officers in Kirkwood, investigating a tip about a white truck parked at a local apartment complex, spotted a vehicle that matched the description. It belonged to a man named Michael Devlin. Devlin was a 41-year-old manager at an Imo's pizza parlor. He was a hefty man, weighing nearly 300 pounds. To his neighbors, he was a bit odd, quiet, and a loner, but certainly not a monster. He paid his rent. He went to work. He didn't cause trouble. When the police knocked on Devlin's door on January 12, they were looking for Ben Ownby. They entered the cluttered, messy apartment. And there, sitting in the living room, terrified but alive, was 13-year-old Ben Ownby. It was a moment of triumph. They had found the missing boy in just 4 days. But then, the officers noticed someone else in the apartment. Sitting nearby, playing video games, was a teenager. He looked to be about 15 years old. He had long black hair and piercings. When the officers asked him who he was, he gave a name that froze the blood in their veins. He said, "I'm Sean Hornbeck." The officers were stunned. Sean Hornbeck wasn't just another kid. He was the most famous missing child in Missouri. He had vanished 4 years earlier, in October of 2002, while riding his bicycle in Richwoods, Missouri. His parents had spent every day of those 4 years searching. They had started the Sean Hornbeck Foundation. They had appeared on national television. Most people assumed Sean was dead, buried in a shallow grave somewhere in the Ozarks. And yet, here he was. Alive. Just 50 miles from his home. Living in an apartment with a pizza manager. The discovery of the Missouri Miracle, 2 lost boys found alive in the same room, sparked global jubilation. But as the details emerged, the joy turned to a profound and disturbing confusion. The question on everyone's lips was, why didn't he run? Sean Hornbeck had lived with Michael Devlin for 4 years. He wasn't kept in a cage. He wasn't chained to a radiator. Neighbors reported seeing him riding his bike in the parking lot. He had sleepovers with friends he made in the complex. He even went to the grocery store with Devlin. He had access to the internet. To the outside world, he appeared to be Devlin's son. This is why Michael Devlin is number 5 on our list. He was a master of psychological imprisonment. He proved that the strongest chains are not made of iron, they are made of fear. Michael Devlin abducted Sean in 2002 by knocking him off his bike and threatening him with a gun. He drove him to the apartment and began a campaign of terror. He told Sean that if he ever tried to escape, if he ever tried to call for help, Devlin would not just kill him, he would go to Sean's house and kill his parents. He would kill his siblings. Devlin systematically stripped away Sean's identity. He forced him to call him Dad. He changed his appearance. He groomed him, abused him sexually, and created a dependency so deep that Sean believed he could not survive without his captor. It was a textbook case of survival adaptation, often colloquially called Stockholm Syndrome, but more accurately described as a coping mechanism for a child in an impossible situation. Sean stayed not because he wanted to, but because he was trying to keep his family alive. For 4 years, Michael Devlin lived a double life. By day, he was the pizza manager, arguing about pepperoni orders. By night, he was the warden of a perverse domestic prison. He was so confident in his control over Sean that he decided to take another child, Ben Ownby, likely believing he could replicate the process. But Ben Ownby was the variable he didn't account for. The abduction of Ben brought the heat of law enforcement to his doorstep before he could break the new boy's spirit. Michael Devlin's arrest shattered the illusion of the quiet neighbor. In the interrogation room, he was matter of fact. He admitted to the abductions. He admitted to the sexual abuse. He offered no complex motive other than his own selfish desires. He was a man who felt entitled to possess other human beings. The legal resolution was swift. To spare the boys the trauma of testifying in court, Michael Devlin pleaded guilty to all charges, including dozens of counts of kidnapping and sexual abuse. In a courtroom filled with weeping family members, he was sentenced to 74 life terms plus 170 years in prison. He will die in a concrete box, a fitting end for a man who tried to put others in one. The aftermath of the case was a difficult journey for the survivors. Sean Hornbeck faced intense public scrutiny. People who didn't understand trauma judged him for not running away. He had to relearn how to be Sean Hornbeck after spending his adolescence as Sean Devlin. But he, like Ben Ownby, showed immense resilience. They reclaimed their lives. This case shocked Missouri because it forced parents to rethink the concept of stranger danger. It wasn't just about the man in the van, it was about the man next door. It forced us to understand that a missing child might be right in front of our faces, hiding behind a wall of psychological terror, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the truth. Number 6, Ken McElroy. We return now to the haunted soil of Skidmore, Missouri. If the murder of Bobby Joe Stinnett in 2004 was a tragedy that broke the town's heart, the event that took place 23 years earlier was the tragedy that hardened its soul. Number 6 on our list is Ken McElroy, a man who technically stands as the victim in his own murder case, but who is undoubtedly the villain of the story. He was the town bully, a term that sounds almost juvenile, but in the case of Ken McElroy, it meant a reign of terror involving arson, theft, assault, statutory rape, and attempted murder. His story shocked the entire state, and indeed the world, because it ended with the ultimate act of frontier justice, a public execution in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens of people, none of whom saw a thing. To understand why the people of Skidmore did what they did, you have to understand the monster they were living with. Ken McElroy was a brute of a man, a cattle rustler and a thief with cold, dead eyes. He was illiterate, uneducated, but possessed a cunning animal intelligence. For decades, he held the tiny town of Skidmore in a grip of fear. He would drive his pickup truck down the main street with a shotgun in the rack, staring down anyone who dared to look at him. His criminal record was a mile long, yet he never spent any significant time in prison. He was indicted more than 20 times for felonies ranging from assault to molestation. But every time he went to court, he walked free. How? He had a brilliant, expensive lawyer named Richard McFadden, and he had a terrifying method of witness intimidation. Whenever someone tried to testify against him, Ken would park outside their house at night. He would stalk their children. He would burn down their barns. Witnesses would recant, terrified for their lives, and the charges would be dropped. The law, it seemed, was powerless against him. The escalation began in 1980. Ken McElroy got into an argument with the town grocer, 70-year-old Ernest Bo Bowenkamp. The dispute was over something trivial, a piece of candy Ken's daughter had allegedly stolen. Ken didn't just argue, he pulled a shotgun and shot the elderly grocer in the neck. Miraculously, Bo Bowenkamp survived. Ken was arrested and charged with attempted murder. This time, the town thought, surely he would go away. He was convicted by a jury. But then, his lawyer pulled a legal maneuver, appealing the conviction and getting Ken released on bail pending the appeal. Ken McElroy returned to Skidmore, free as a bird. And he was angry. He went to the DNG Tavern, the local bar, with an M1 carbine rifle and a bayonet attached to it. He publicly threatened to finish the job. He told people he was going to kill Bo Bowenkamp. He told the town they couldn't stop him. For the people of Skidmore, something snapped. They had tried the police. They had tried the courts. They had tried ignoring him. Nothing worked. They realized that if they didn't act, the grocer, and perhaps others, would be dead by morning. On the morning of July 10, 1981, the mood in Skidmore was electric with tension. A town meeting was called at the Legion Hall. The sheriff told the residents there was nothing more he could do legally until Ken actually hurt someone again. The sheriff then drove out of town, leaving the citizens to their fate. The meeting ended, and the men of the town walked down the street to the DNG Tavern. Inside the bar, Ken McElroy was drinking with his wife, Trenna. He was arrogant, seemingly unaware that the atmosphere outside had shifted from fear to resolve. When he finished his drink, he bought a 6-pack of beer to go. He walked out into the blinding July sunlight. He got into his Chevy Silverado pickup truck. Trenna got into the passenger seat. Ken put the key in the ignition. He was surrounded. A crowd of nearly 60 men, farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, stood in a semicircle around the truck. They didn't say a word. They just watched. Then, shots rang out. It wasn't a single pop. It was a volley. A bullet from a .30-30 rifle struck Ken McElroy. Another blast from a shotgun shattered the glass. Ken McElroy was hit in the head and neck. He slumped over the steering wheel, dead instantly. The silence that followed the gunfire is the most famous silence in American history. Trenna screamed. The crowd simply dispersed. Some went back to work. Some went home to dinner. When the ambulance arrived, 60 people were present. When the state police and the FBI arrived to investigate the murder, they asked the same question to every single person, who shot Ken McElroy. And every single person gave the same answer, I didn't see anything. Some said the sun was in their eyes. Some said they were looking the other way. Some said they were tying their shoes. 60 people stood within feet of a murder, and not one of them would point a finger. The investigation dragged on for months. A grand jury was convened. Trenna McElroy testified, naming a local rancher as the shooter. But without any corroborating witnesses, and with the entire town closing ranks, no charges could be filed. The grand jury refused to indict anyone. The case of Ken McElroy became a media sensation. 60 Minutes came to town. A book, In Broad Daylight, became a bestseller. The world was fascinated by this act of collective vigilante justice. Was it murder? Or was it self-defense by a community that had been abandoned by the law? Ken McElroy is number 6 on our list because he represents the failure of the system. He was a criminal so disturbing that he turned decent, law-abiding citizens into killers. He pushed a peaceful town to the brink of anarchy. Today, Ken McElroy is buried in a cemetery in St. Joseph, Missouri. His grave is often vandalized. Back in Skidmore, the D&G Tavern is gone, and the population has dwindled. But the secret remains. The men who pulled the triggers that day took their secret to the grave, protected by their neighbors in a pact of silence that has never been broken. Number 7, Pam Hupp. We leave the gritty history of the past and step into the fluorescent lights of the 21st century. Number 7 on our list is a woman who, at first glance, looks like the quintessential Midwestern neighbor. She drove a silver SUV. She worked in life insurance. She was a mother and a grandmother. Her name is Pam Hupp. But behind the suburban facade lay a mind of staggering Machiavellian complexity. Pam Hupp shocked the entire state of Missouri not just because she killed, but because she successfully manipulated police, prosecutors, and judges into doing her dirty work for her. She framed an innocent man, sent him to prison, and then killed a disabled stranger in a desperate bid to keep her lies alive. She is the ultimate puppet master, a serial liar who believed she could outsmart everyone. To understand the chaos Pam Hupp unleashed, we must start with her victim, Elizabeth "Betsy" Faria. In 2011, Betsy was living in the small town of Troy, Missouri. She was a woman facing a tragic battle. She had terminal breast cancer that had metastasized to her liver. Despite her illness, she remained spirited and surrounded by friends. One of those friends was Pam Hupp. On December 27, 2011, Betsy Faria underwent chemotherapy. Pam Hupp offered to drive her home. It seemed like a kind gesture. But Pam had a secret agenda. Just days earlier, on December 23, Pam had convinced the dying woman to make a drastic change to her life insurance policy. Betsy had a State Farm policy worth $150,000. Originally, the beneficiary was her husband, Russ Faria. But Pam convinced Betsy to sign a change of beneficiary form, naming Pam Hupp as the sole recipient. Pam claimed she would put the money in a trust for Betsy's daughters to ensure Russ didn't squander it. It was a lie. There was no trust. The money was for Pam. That night, after dropping Betsy off, Pam Hupp became the last person to see her alive. When Russ Faria came home later that evening after a weekly game night with friends, he found a scene of carnage. Betsy was dead on the living room floor. She had been stabbed 55 times. The knife was still in her neck. Russ, hysterical, called 911. In his shock and grief, he told the dispatcher, "I think my wife killed herself." He knew she was depressed about the cancer. But obviously, one does not stab themselves 55 times. The police arrived and immediately zeroed in on the husband. It is a standard rule of thumb, the husband is always the first suspect. But the police in Lincoln County didn't just suspect Russ, they developed tunnel vision, guided by the helpful hand of Pam Hupp. Pam Hupp inserted herself into the investigation immediately. She told detectives that Russ was abusive. She told them Russ had a violent temper. She told them she feared for Betsy's life. She acted the part of the grieving best friend perfectly. Meanwhile, she was sipping a large soft drink in the interrogation room, casually weaving a web of lies that would destroy a man's life. The injustice that followed was infuriating. Despite having a solid alibi, he was at a movie night with 4 witnesses and had receipts from Arby's. Russ Faria was charged with murder. The prosecutor, Leah Askey, built the case almost entirely on Pam Hupp's testimony and character assassination. In 2013, Russ Faria was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Pam Hupp had won. She had the $150,000, and the perfect scapegoat was rotting in a cell. But the story didn't end there. The verdict didn't sit right with journalists, specifically the team at Dateline NBC and producer Keith Morrison. They began to dig. They saw the holes in the case. They saw that Pam Hupp's story changed every time she told it. They saw that she had kept the money and never gave a dime to Betsy's daughters, eventually even facing a lawsuit from them, which she won on a technicality, cementing her status as a villain. In 2015, a new trial was ordered for Russ Faria. This time, his defense lawyer was allowed to present evidence implicating Pam Hupp as an alternative suspect. The judge, seeing the overwhelming reasonable doubt, exonerated Russ Faria. He was a free man. This terrified Pam Hupp. With Russ free, the eyes of the law turned toward her. The Lincoln County Police were looking at her. The St. Louis media was hounding her. She was losing control. In August of 2016, Pam Hupp decided she needed to shift the narrative again. She needed to prove that Russ Faria was violent. She needed a new villain. This leads us to the most disturbing chapter of her crimes, the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. Louis Gumpenberger was 33 years old. He was a tragic figure. In 2005, he had been in a severe car accident that left him physically and mentally disabled. He walked with a limp, had limited cognitive function, and lived a quiet life with his mother in O'Fallon. He was harmless. Pam Hupp saw him not as a person, but as a prop. On August 16, 2016, Pam drove her SUV around O'Fallon looking for a victim. She initially approached a woman, claiming she was a producer for Dateline NBC and offering her money to reenact a 911 call. The woman, sensing danger, refused and noted the license plate. Pam kept driving. She found Louis Gumpenberger sitting on his front stoop. She used the same ruse. She told the mentally disabled man that she was a producer and would pay him nearly $1,000 if he helped her with a sound script for a TV show. Louis, trusting and in need of money, got into her car. She drove him to her home. She instructed him to call 911. She told him to shout specific instructions. While Louis was on the phone, Pam Hupp shot him. She shot him multiple times, killing him instantly in her front hallway. When police arrived, Pam spun a wild tale. She claimed that Louis Gumpenberger had broken into her home. She claimed he had a knife and a note in his pocket. The note, conveniently planted by Pam, read, "Kidnap Hupp. Get the money. Russ Faria sent me." It was a setup designed to frame Russ Faria for hiring a hitman. She wanted the police to believe that Russ was trying to kill her from beyond the courtroom. But this time, Pam Hupp was too arrogant. The setup was too perfect. The note was absurd. The knife was brand new. And most importantly, police found $900 in cash in Lewis's pocket, money that Pam had planted, but unwittingly linking herself to him. They also found the witness she had tried to lure earlier that day. The soccer mom mask shattered. The police realized she had hunted a disabled man and executed him solely to take the heat off herself. Pam Hupp was arrested. In 2019, to avoid the death penalty for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger, she entered an Alford plea, a guilty plea where the defendant maintains innocence but admits the evidence is sufficient to convict. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the wheel of justice continued to turn. With Pam locked away and her credibility destroyed, the authorities in Lincoln County finally reopened the Betsy Faria case. In July 2021, nearly 10 years after the stabbing, Pam Hupp was officially charged with the first-degree murder of her best friend, Betsy Faria. Pam Hupp stands as number 7 on our list because of the sheer audacity of her evil. She is a woman who treated real life like a chess game. She killed a dying woman for money. She destroyed a grieving husband for cover. And she executed a disabled stranger for distraction. She is the embodiment of the suburban sociopath, proving that the most dangerous person on the street isn't the gangster or the drifter, it's the friendly lady offering you a ride home. Number 8, Lorenzo Gilliard. We return to Kansas City, Missouri, a metropolis that seems to have more than its fair share of monsters. But unlike the flamboyant cruelty of Robert Berdella, the monster at number 8 was a ghost. He didn't keep trophies. He didn't write journals. He didn't taunt the police. He simply killed, dumped the bodies, and went home to dinner. His name is Lorenzo Gilliard, known to the press as the Kansas City Strangler. He stands on this list because he is the most prolific serial killer in Kansas City history in terms of confirmed convictions, yet for nearly 2 decades, no one even knew he existed. He represents the terrifying efficiency of the blue-collar killer, the man who services your streets, picks up your trash, and smiles at you, all while harboring a darkness that claimed the lives of 13 women. To understand how Lorenzo Gilliard operated, you have to look at the camouflage he wore. Gilliard was not a drifter. He was a pillar of his small community. He worked for the city sanitation department as a trash collector. It was the perfect job for a predator. He knew the city's geography better than the police. He knew which alleys were dark, which dumpsters were rarely checked, and which neighborhoods were ignored. He was a physically imposing man, strong from years of lifting heavy bins, but he had a reputation for being polite and helpful. He was married. He raised a family. He wore expensive watches and drove nice cars. To his neighbors, he was a success story, a man who had pulled himself up from a rough background to build a solid middle-class life. But when the sun went down, the sanitation worker became the strangler. His reign of terror spanned from 1977 to 1993. His targets were almost exclusively women involved in prostitution or battling drug addiction. Like many serial killers of his era, such as the Green River Killer or the Grim Sleeper, Gilliard chose these victims because he knew society viewed them as lesser. He knew the police investigation into the death of a sex worker was often brief and uninspired. He counted on the city's apathy to protect him. His method was brutal and intimate. He would pick up the women in his car. He would drive them to secluded spots, under bridges, in vacant lots or quiet cul-de-sacs. There, the transaction would turn into a fight for life. Gilliard didn't use guns or knives. He used his hands. He strangled his victims. Strangulation is a personal way to kill. It requires time, strength, and a proximity that most people cannot stomach. Gilliard thrived on it. After the life had left their eyes, He would dump their bodies like the trash he collected during the day. He left them in weeds, in alleys, and near creek beds. He didn't bury them. He didn't try to hide them. He simply discarded them and drove away. For 16 years, the body count rose. Catherine Berry in 1977. Naomi Kelly in 1983. Ann Barnes in 1984. Kelly Huff in 1987. The list went on and on. 13 names. 13 daughters, mothers, and sisters found dead with bruises on their necks. During this entire time, the Kansas City Police Department struggled to connect the dots. Because the killings were spread out over so many years, and because the victims were high-risk individuals, they were often treated as isolated incidents or drug deals gone wrong. There was no task force hunting Gilliard in the 80s. He was invisible. The killings appeared to stop in 1993. Why? It remains a mystery. Perhaps he got too old. Perhaps he felt the heat. Or perhaps he simply found other ways to satisfy his urges. For the next decade, Lorenzo Gilliard lived the life of a retiree. He enjoyed his family. He went to church. He thought he had gotten away with it. And he almost did. But science was catching up. In 2004, the Kansas City Police Department's Cold Case Unit began a massive project to re-examine DNA evidence from unsolved murders. They had preserved biological samples, semen and skin cells, found on the bodies of the strangled women from the 80s and 90s. But having the DNA was useless without a name to match it to. Lorenzo Gilliard was not in the DNA database for murder. But he was in the system for something else. Throughout his life, he had minor brushes with the law, stalking charges, disputes, minor assaults. It was a sample taken during a completely unrelated investigation that finally put his genetic code into the Cody system. In 2004, the computer made a match. And then another. And another. The lab technicians were stunned. The DNA from 13 different cold cases, spanning nearly 20 years, all matched one man. When the police moved to arrest Lorenzo Gilliard, they didn't find him in a crack house or hiding in the woods. They found him at his comfortable home, eating dinner with his wife. He was 53 years old. He looked like a grandfather. The interrogation of Lorenzo Gilliard was frustrating. He didn't crack like Robert Berdella. He didn't boast like Maury Travis. He denied everything. He was indignant. He claimed he had never killed anyone. When confronted with the DNA evidence, the mathematical certainty that his semen was found on 13 dead women, he simply shrugged. He claimed he had sex with them, sure, because he frequented prostitutes, but he didn't kill them. He claimed he was being framed. His arrogance carried into the courtroom. The trial in 2007 was a marathon. Gilliard sat stoically, wearing sweaters and looking bored, while the prosecution laid out the gruesome timeline of his double life. They presented the DNA evidence, which was irrefutable. They presented the similar modus operandi, across all the murders. The defense tried to argue that the DNA only proved sexual contact, not murder. But the sheer volume of coincidence was impossible to ignore. 13 women didn't just happen to die of strangulation after having sex with the same sanitation worker. On March 16, 2007, the jury found Lorenzo Gilliard guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. Due to legal complexities and statutes of limitations on evidence, they focused on the strongest cases, but he is widely considered responsible for all 13 and possibly more. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lorenzo Gilliard remains incarcerated at the Crossroads Correctional Center in Missouri. To this day, he maintains his innocence. He has never offered an apology. He has never explained why. He stands as number 8 on our list because he is the definition of the hidden monster. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't a mastermind. He was just a man who realized that if you prey on the forgotten, the world will let you get away with murder for a very, very long time. Number 9, Sharon Kinney. We leave the gritty streets of modern Kansas City and travel back in time to Independence, Missouri, in the year 1960. It was a time of beehive hairdos, tail-finned cars, and the illusion of suburban innocence. In this wholesome setting lived a woman named Sharon Kinney. To her neighbors, she was a 20-year-old housewife and mother of 2. She was striking, with dark hair, piercing eyes, and a cold, calculating intelligence that she hid behind a charming smile. Sharon Kinney stands as number 9 on our list not because of the brutality of her crimes, though they were brutal, but because of her audacity. She is a triple murderer who killed in 2 different countries. She is a woman who turned the American legal system into a circus. And most terrifying of all, she is a ghost. In 1969, she vanished into the Mexican night, and to this day, she remains one of the longest-running fugitives in the history of law enforcement. Her story is a reminder that sometimes, the bad guy, or in this case, the bad girl, gets away. To understand Sharon Kinney, you have to understand her hunger. She was born Sharon Elizabeth Hall in 1939. By all accounts, she was a difficult child, demanding, manipulative, and obsessed with material wealth. She married James Kinney when she was just 16. James was a good man, hardworking and devoted, but he couldn't keep up with Sharon's spending. She wanted the finest clothes, the best furniture, and a life of leisure. When James couldn't provide it, she grew bored. And when Sharon Kinney got bored, people died. The first body dropped on March 19, 1960. It was a lazy afternoon. James Kinney was taking a nap in the bedroom. Their 2-year-old daughter, Dana, was playing in the house. Sharon would later tell police that the little girl had wandered into the bedroom, picked up James's .22 caliber high-standard pistol from the nightstand, and, accidentally, pulled the trigger. James was shot in the back of the head. He died instantly. The police were skeptical. It is incredibly difficult for a 2-year-old to lift a heavy pistol, aim it, and pull a trigger with enough force to fire. But Sharon was a masterful actress. She played the grieving widow. She wept. She held her children. And without hard forensic evidence to prove she pulled the trigger, the police had to accept the tragic accident theory. James Kinney was buried, and Sharon collected the life insurance money. She bought a new Ford Thunderbird the next day. But one murder wasn't enough. Sharon wasn't just greedy, she was lustful. Before James was even cold in the ground, Sharon was pursuing a man named Walter Jones. Walter was a car salesman, and more importantly, he was married. His wife was a sweet, unsuspecting woman named Patricia Jones. Sharon wanted Walter. But Walter wasn't interested in leaving his wife for a woman suspected of killing her husband. He tried to break it off. Sharon didn't take rejection well. She decided that if she couldn't have Walter, no one could, or rather, she would remove the obstacle standing in her way. That obstacle was Patricia. On May 26, 1960, Patricia Jones disappeared. She had told friends she was meeting a woman to discuss something important. That evening, Sharon Kinney was seen engaging in a bizarre search for Patricia, acting overly concerned, trying to insert herself into the investigation just like she did with her husband. The next day, Patricia's body was found in a secluded, Lover's Lane area outside of town. She had been shot 4 times. The investigation led straight to Sharon. She was the last person seen with Patricia. And when police searched Sharon's house, they found a green pistol. Ballistics tests confirmed it was the murder weapon. Sharon Kinney was arrested and charged with the murder of Patricia Jones. And then, surprisingly, she was also charged with the murder of her husband, James Kinney, as new evidence came to light suggesting that toddler accident was physically impossible. The trials of Sharon Kinney were a sensation. She was dubbed the Sharon Kinney story in the papers. She wore fashionable outfits to court. She smiled at the jury. In the trial for Patricia Jones's murder, Sharon was acquitted. The jury found the evidence circumstantial. It was a shocking verdict. In the trial for James Kinney's murder, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But then, due to a procedural error regarding the jury selection, the verdict was overturned. A second trial ended in a hung jury. Sharon Kinney was released on bail while awaiting a fourth trial. She was free. A triple murderer, in the eyes of the police, was walking the streets of Missouri. But Sharon knew her luck was running out. She knew the next jury would likely convict her. So, in September of 1964, she did what any more villain would do, she ran. She crossed the border into Mexico. She traveled with a new lover, a man named Francis Samuel Pugliese. But Sharon didn't lay low. She couldn't help herself. She was a predator in a new jungle. On September 18, 1964, in a motel room in Mexico City, Sharon Kinney struck again. This time, the victim was a Mexican-born American citizen named Francisco Paredes Ordóñez. Sharon claimed he tried to assault her. The evidence showed she shot him in the chest. But Mexican police weren't as easily charmed as the Missouri juries. They arrested her. When they searched her motel room, they didn't just find the gun that killed Ordóñez. They found the .22 caliber pistol that had killed Patricia Jones. She had kept the murder weapon all those years. Sharon Kinney was convicted of homicide in Mexico. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, later extended to 13 years after an appeal. She was sent to the Ixtapalapa Women's Prison. This should have been the end of the story. Sharon Kinney, the La Pistolera, the gun woman, rotting in a Mexican jail cell. But Sharon Kinney was not meant for a cage. On the night of December 7, 1969, a mysterious blackout plunged the Ixtapalapa prison into darkness. It was a chaotic scene. Guards were scrambling. In the confusion, Sharon Kinney, who had likely bribed the guards or had outside help, slipped out of her cell. She scaled a wall. She jumped into a waiting car. And she vanished. The manhunt was massive. The Mexican authorities, embarrassed by the escape, searched everywhere. The FBI joined the hunt, eager to bring her back to Missouri for the murders of James and Patricia. They checked border crossings. They checked airports. They chased rumors to Guatemala, to South America, even to Europe. But Sharon Kinney was gone. There have been sightings over the years, of course. Whispers of a woman in Guatemala running a hotel. Rumors of a grandmother in Texas who looks suspiciously like the old mugshots. But not a single confirmed trace of her has been found since that night in 1969. If she is still alive today, Sharon Kinney would be in her mid-80s. She could be the sweet old lady sitting next to you on the bus. She could be your neighbor. Sharon Kinney is number 9 on our list because she defeated the system completely. She killed her husband and got away with it. She killed her rival and was acquitted. She killed a man in Mexico and broke out of prison. She is a legend of Missouri crime, a black widow, who spun a web so large that she managed to slip through the holes and disappear into history. Number 10, the Bobby Greenlease kidnapping. We conclude our journey through the darkness of Missouri by traveling back to a time that lives in sepia-toned memory. It is September, 1953. Kansas City is booming. It is the era of post-war optimism, big cars, and the belief that the American dream is within reach for everyone. In the wealthy enclave of Mission Hills, the Greenlease family lived that dream. Robert Greenlease Sr. was a multimillionaire Cadillac dealer, a man who had everything. But his most prized possession was not his fortune, it was his 6-year-old son, Bobby. Bobby Greenlease was a sweet, trusting boy with a bright smile. He attended the Notre Dame de Chaune, an exclusive Catholic private school. It was a fortress of safety, run by nuns. But on September 28, 1953, a woman walked into that school and committed a crime so cold-blooded that it changed the way parents looked at their children forever. Number 10 on our list is the kidnapping and murder of Bobby Greenlease. It stands as the final entry because it represents the original sin of modern Missouri crime, a tragedy of greed, police corruption, and the senseless slaughter of a child that still brings tears to the eyes of those who remember it. The villains of this story were an unlikely pair. Carl Hall was the failed son of a wealthy attorney, a drug addict and an alcoholic who had squandered his inheritance. Bonnie Hetty was a prostitute and a desperate woman who had fallen under Hall's spell. Together, they concocted a plan to get rich quick. They didn't want to rob a bank, they wanted to steal a life. On that cool September morning, Bonnie Hetty walked into the Notre Dame de Chaune school. She looked respectable, dressed in a skirt and holding a handkerchief. She told the nun at the desk that she was Bobby's aunt. She lied, claiming that Bobby's mother had suffered a heart attack and had been rushed to the hospital. She said she needed to take Bobby to see her immediately. In 1953, people trusted each other. Security protocols didn't exist. The nun, concerned for the family, went to the classroom and got little Bobby. She took his hand and placed it in the hand of Bonnie Hetty. Bobby, trusting the adult, walked out of the school and into a station wagon where Carl Hall was waiting. As they drove away, the nuns felt a twinge of unease. They called the Greenlease home to check on the mother. When Mrs. Greenlease answered the phone, healthy and confused, the horror set in. But the true tragedy had already happened. Unlike most kidnappings where the victim is kept alive as leverage, Carl Hall had no intention of keeping a 6-year-old boy. He viewed Bobby not as a hostage, but as a liability. Just shortly after the abduction, they drove across the state line into a field in Overland Park, Kansas. While Bonnie Hetty distracted the boy, Carl Hall attempted to strangle him. When that failed to kill him quickly enough, Hall pulled out a revolver and shot the 6-year-old in the head. Bobby Greenlease was dead before his parents even knew he was missing. Hall and Hetty then drove the body to St. Joseph, Missouri. They buried the child in a shallow grave in the backyard of Bonnie Hetty's house, planting chrysanthemums over the fresh dirt to hide the crime. Then, the psychological torture of the Greenlease family began. For days, the parents waited by the phone. Hall and Hetty sent ransom notes demanding $600,000, the equivalent of over $6 million today. It was the largest ransom demand in American history at the time. The letters were taunting. They claimed Bobby was alive. They claimed he was missing his mommy. The Greenlease family, desperate to save their son, scrambled to get the cash. Robert Greenlease Sr. followed the instructions. He packed the money into a duffel bag. In a cinematic midnight drop, the money was left on a rural bridge. Carl Hall collected it. The family waited for Bobby to be returned. They waited, and they waited. But the phone never rang again. Flush with cash, Hall and Hetty fled to St. Louis. They rented an expensive apartment. They planned to live like kings. But their incompetence, and their addiction, was their undoing. Carl Hall began spending money recklessly. He drank heavily. He hired a cab driver named John Hager to drive him around town to find prostitutes and booze. John Hager, a sharp-eyed veteran cabbie, noticed the massive wads of cash Hall was carrying. He also noticed that Hall fit the description of the kidnapper that was being broadcast on every radio station. Hager went to the St. Louis police. On October 5, 1953, police led by Lieutenant Louis Shoulders kicked down the door of the apartment. They found Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty. They found the guns. And they found the suitcases full of money. But the arrest brought no relief to the Greenlease family. In the interrogation room, Carl Hall coldly confessed. He told them the money didn't matter. He told them Bobby was never coming home. He gave up the location of the grave in St. Joseph. The recovery of Bobby's body shattered the nation. The image of the police digging up the flower bed to find the small boy in his school uniform was printed in newspapers across the country. It was a loss of innocence for America. But the scandal wasn't over. When the police counted the recovered ransom money, they found only $300,000. Half of the money, $300,000, was missing. Carl Hall insisted he had the full amount when he was arrested. Suspicions turned to the arresting officers, Lieutenant Shoulders and Patrolman Elmer Dolan. It was widely believed that the corrupt cops had stolen half the ransom money before booking the evidence. The money was never found. The two officers were later indicted for perjury, and their careers were ruined, adding a layer of dirty grit to an already heartbreaking case. The justice for Hall and Hetty was swift and merciless. The federal government took over the case because they had crossed state lines. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in record time, just 81 days after the kidnapping. On December 18, 1953, Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty were led to the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. They were executed side by side. Bonnie Hetty became the only woman ever executed by the federal government until Lisa Montgomery, our number 2 entry, in 2021. The kidnapping of Bobby Greenlease is number 10 because it is the wound that never fully healed. It changed everything. Schools implemented safe lists for picking up children. Parents stopped letting their kids walk home alone. It taught us that wealth cannot buy safety, and that monsters can wear white gloves and smile at nuns. The Greenlease family eventually moved away, unable to live in the house where they waited for a son who would never return. But in the history of Missouri crime, the name Bobby Greenlease stands as a permanent reminder of the fragility of life.